Attention, you're listening to The Todd Huff Show, America's home for conservative, not bitter talk and education. Be advised, the content of this program has been documented to prevent and even cure liberalism, and listening may cause you to lean to the right. And now, coming to you from the Full Suite Wealth Studios, here's your conservative but not bitter host, Todd Huff.
Well, greetings, my friends, on this very special edition of the Todd Huff Show. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not supposed to have favorite episodes, but I do. And this is my favorite episode of the year. This is our special episode where we tell the true story of Thanksgiving. I love it. I'm not sorry that I love it. I guess I'm sorry that I have a favorite episode. This is it. And I'll tell you why as we get into the program today. But thank you for tuning in with us today and for taking time to learn, to remember, to recognize the true story of Thanksgiving. I'm excited. Cannot wait to get to it, my friends. Maybe before we get started, though, you've reached that stage where managing your money feels more like juggling than just managing numbers. There's tax planning, estate work, investment choices, a whole lot more. That's when family office services can really make a difference. Full Suite Wealth brings all those pieces together into one cohesive strategy. Their family office services gives you access to a coordinated team with advanced options, strategies, private equity, private credit, legal expertise, all those things, my friend, under one roof. It's about simplifying your financial life, planning for the future, making sure your legacy stays strong for generations to come. You ready for that next level of support? If so, visit fullsuitewealth.com, my friends. That's fullsuitewealth.com. Build your legacy, secure your future. All right, the true story of Thanksgiving. Let me tell you off the top here. I first heard this story as a listener to Rush Limbaugh's program. Roughly, I started listening in 1999, so somewhere 25, 26 years ago that I first would have heard this story. He told this story the day before Thanksgiving, every year. It was my favorite episode of his, which was saying a lot because I admired him in ways I can't truly express. He first shared this story in his book, See, I Told You So, which I have a copy of. And so we'll just kind of go through this. And again, I want to tell you, I'm not trying to steal what Rush did. I'm trying to do two things. Number one, honor his memory and his legacy. Number two, continue the tradition of making sure that we pass along one of the greatest lessons we can get from a historical event concerning the foundation of this country, which matters tremendously in our ability to navigate political issues of the times and to teach the next generation the truth about the blessings we have in this great nation. So if you were like me, if you were like Rush, what you probably learned in public school about Thanksgiving went something like this. A group of people called the Pilgrims found their way to America somehow, landing on Plymouth Rock December 22nd, 1620, maybe December 21st. Again, we'll get into some questions about little details, but December of 1620. The Native Americans, the Indians, came along and saved the Pilgrims because the Pilgrims didn't know how to do things like grow food or catch beavers or whatever they had to do to survive. And then the Pilgrims had this big celebratory feast where they thanked the Native Americans for saving their lives. And then, of course, the lesson that is often taught today is without the Indians, there wouldn't be a country, there wouldn't be a people. They all would have died out that first year. But At least the Pilgrims paid them back before the rest of the Europeans came along and stole all their land. But this is not at all the story of Thanksgiving. Certainly, some Indians, Native Americans, helped the Pilgrims. And I'll talk a little bit about Squanto here in a minute. But the bottom line here is that more and more people, because of Rush and his telling of this story and making sure people understood it, more and more people are learning this real story of Thanksgiving, and it is spreading. So let's get some historical context. King James I was king of England during this time frame, during the 1600s, when the Pilgrims would have made their way to the New World. The lesson that we are going to learn here is that socialism failed then, and it will fail again each and every time it is tried. So, in the 1600s, King James I was persecuting those who did not recognize the state churches of power, absolute power, and civil authority. And so, back in those days, and this is what the Pilgrims were fleeing, a lot of people were fleeing, this was the lack of religious freedom. You had to belong to or adhere to the teachings of the Church of England, the government's church. You couldn't have your own sect or denomination, and you were persecuted. In fact, if you opposed the Church of England, the state church, you were hunted down and punished, sometimes severely punished. And so a group of separatists, these were people who wanted religious freedom. They wanted to be separate from the Church of England. They fled first to Holland. Good old Holland over there. They were there for 11 years. About 40 of those individuals agreed to go to the New World, to America, for religious liberty. And so, 102 total people set voyage on the Mayflower. About 41 of those were the Pilgrims, the separatists. They knew they were going to face hardship. Folks, as I tell this story, one of the things we're going to talk about is the extreme hardship that they faced. They knew they were going to face hardship. I don't know that they knew that they would face it to the degree that they dealt with it. I don't think that they were prepared for that. They certainly weren't prepared for it, as we will find out. But they knew that they were going to have difficulties, maybe even severe difficulties. But this is the lesson. For people, there's many lessons tucked within the greater lesson, but this perhaps is one of those key lessons. Living freely and worshiping God according to their own beliefs, to their own consciences, outweighed whatever lack of hardship they were dealing with in Europe. You don't know what you've got until it's gone. Too many Americans today, we live in this. Listen, I understand we all have difficulties. I understand that there are still many problems we are dealing with in this country. I understand that times have been tough, and we're still digging out of a massive hole that has been created by these broken ideological, the broken worldview and broken promises that are given to us, bestowed upon us by these leftists, and that every person this side of heaven experiences loss and tragedy. Some losses is just part of life, the loss of loved ones, the loss of health, things like that, divorce, financial turmoil, whatever. And there's also other situations that that maybe don't just fall into that bucket. But in addition to just the normal difficulties of life, the Pilgrims knew that by coming to the New World, it was going to be hard. It was not going to be easy, but it was worth it. It was worth it for them to live freely, to worship God according to their own conscience. And so they made this journey across the Atlantic Ocean. William Bradford, when they finally landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, by the way, they were way far north of where they intended to make landfall. But when they landed, or as they were on the ship for a while. At the beginning of the program, I mentioned the exact date of landing. There's a little bit of a question mark as to when they actually landed, because they were on the ship right off the shore for some period of time, several weeks, kind of hammering out this Mayflower, finishing, I guess, the agreements of the Mayflower Compact. That was the laws that they all agreed to live by. Those laws, by the way, came from the Bible. That's important, too, for other conversations we're having in our current culture. But the Pilgrims were devoutly religious. It wasn't just something they did on Sundays. Their faith changed the people that they were. The way that it impacted the way that they lived their lives, the things that they did, the things that they found to be worthy of pursuit. These individuals were devout. They had a great faith and trust in God, and they looked to the biblical example of the Israelites as their example. They looked to the scriptures for lessons and teachings and things that they could implement in their lives. They never doubted that they would get to the New World and survive and even thrive. They landed, again, November, December. Again, understand they were there for several weeks before they actually put foot on the ground. But they landed in November, further north than where they first anticipated. So this time of year, more or less, it was cold, it was barren, there was desolate wilderness. There was not a Walmart, there wasn't a Target, there wasn't a 7-Eleven, there weren't highways, there weren't hotels, there weren't restaurants, restaurant chains, local pubs. There was nothing but the cold, hard realities of nature in the Northeast during this time of year, and the colder weather was coming. It was going to get colder. When they landed, it was cold. It was going to get colder, more extreme, and they were in for one heck of a winter. They had no shelter of any kind. Nothing existed for them to just take up refuge in. They didn't have a city to go to. It was barren. It was desolate. It was cold. It was late in the year. Winter was upon them. And the sacrifice they had made for their freedom to worship, this is what they gave up. This is what they willingly stepped into. Again, some of the details, the extremity of the weather was a little bit different because they missed their target site and so forth, but they knew that this is what they wanted. They chose that freedom over the safety and comforts of life in Europe. But this was just the beginning. That first winter claimed the lives of half of the Pilgrims. Let that sink in. So you land in November of 1620. By spring, a mere 90, 100 days, whatever later, 120 days later maybe, they lost half of the people who were in their group of pilgrims were suddenly dead. One of those deceased individuals was Dorothy Bradford. She was the wife of Governor Bradford. So even the governor's wife, the leader of the group, his wife did not make it that first winter. It was a brutal survivor those first few months in the New World. It was brutal. Spring finally came, and I'm sure it seemed like forever, my friends. The Pilgrims met the Native Americans. Those Native Americans helped them plant crops. They helped them hunt beaver, fish, all that kind of stuff. And one of those individuals, one of those local natives, was an individual named Squanto. And I just want to tell you a little bit about Squanto because it's an interesting story, and he certainly helped the Pilgrims. There's no doubt that the Native Americans helped the Pilgrims. The Native Americans helped them survive, and there's no doubt the Pilgrims were grateful for those lessons. And we'll get into all this, but that's not the end of the story. That's not the true story ultimately of what was learned here. So, Squanto's real name was Tisquantum. He belonged to the Patuxet, a band within the Wampanoag Confederacy, and his village, the Patuxet Village, was located exactly where the Pilgrims would later found the city of Plymouth, Massachusetts. Now, Squanto in 1614, keep in mind, the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth in 1620, but in 1614, Squanto was kidnapped by an Englishman by the name of Thomas Hunt. Thomas Hunt kidnapped him, took him to Spain, and then had taken him there to sell him into slavery. He was saved. Squanto was saved by some friars in Spain. They helped him escape, and Squanto traveled to England. He lived with merchants, and in that process, he became fluent in English. He became able to speak. Obviously, he's living over there now. Crazy circumstances. He was freed, living over there, and learned the language. This made him very uniquely able to communicate with the Pilgrims, who, of course, came speaking English. Now, Squanto returned, not ironically, or I guess you could say ironically, sometime between 1619, either in 1619 or 1620. And when he returned, so that the timing, he returns right as the Pilgrims are about to land there. He found that his entire tribe had died from a plague, probably something like smallpox that was carried unknowingly by these settlers, and he effectively became the last Patuxet Native American. Now, he was there when the Pilgrims landed, when they were in dire straits. That spring after that first unbearable winter, they met him. Of course, he spoke English. He was able to teach them how to grow corn, how to fish, how to do all those things, hunt beavers, all that stuff, understand the local seasons, understand the planting seasons, all that sort of thing. And he served as a translator between the Pilgrims and other Native Americans. He helped negotiate peace. He helped work out trade agreements. I mean, this guy was the Donald J. Trump of the time. I said that for Oz. No reaction over there by Oz. But Bradford said of him, Governor Bradford said of him later in one of his diaries, his journals, he said that Squanto was, quote, a special instrument sent of God for their good. So, again, a lot of circumstances led to some pretty incredible little details like that. But even with his help, he was critically important. Do not misunderstand me. There's still even a greater lesson, a wonderful lesson with Squanto can be learned. But there's even a greater lesson that many Americans miss, and we're getting to it. But even with that help, which was critically important, they still didn't thrive and prosper. They survived. Half of them did. And Squanto helped them to be better prepared for the next winter, but that still wasn't the lesson. But this is where the story typically ends, right? You get through the planting season, the harvest season of 1621, and Squanto, the other local Native Americans, had helped the Pilgrims to grow food and learn how to survive off the land and that sort of thing. And so there's this Thanksgiving, and it's often portrayed as a feast of gratitude for the locals for helping to save their lives. But this is not really it at all. This is, in a sense, what happened, but that was in no way the final real deal. In fact, even the first Thanksgiving, which was in 1621, after the harvest, it was a devout expression of gratitude from the Pilgrims to God for their survival and prosperity. Now, the Pilgrims were thankful, as I even read a quote from Bradford's diary there talking about Squanto. They were thankful for Squanto. They were thankful for the Native Americans, but their gratitude begins and ends with God. I was listening this Sunday at church, our pastor. We have an interim pastor as we look for a full-time pastor at our church, but he's done a wonderful job. I think the world of this guy, the interim pastor. And he was talking about this very thing. We were talking about gratitude. And he made the point to say that all good things, and he's right on this. You know this already, but you just need to hear it. I need to hear it, be reminded of it. All good things find their source in God. All good things, left to our own devices, folks, we're incapable. I know some people are reluctant to believe that, and there are degrees from a human perspective. There certainly are degrees to evil, but we're not capable of good on our own. All good finds at its source God. And so that's why ultimately the Pilgrims were thankful to God. They were thankful for Squanto, but they were thankful to God as the one who gave them help that came through Squanto. They saw this as a divinely orchestrated sort of event. But that's not the end of the story. So there's more to learn, more to get to. I'm going to pause here because there's just a lot to get through, and I don't want to kind of be in the middle of this next session. So we're going to take a quick time out. Friends, I want to remind you as well that we here at the Todd Huff Show have a division of our business called Red, White, and Brand. It helps you put your logo on almost anything, whether that's apparel, whether that's trade show materials, whether that's booths and signage, you name it, my friends. Red, White, and Brand can help put your logo on almost anything. You can visit the website, learn more, redwhiteandbrand.com. You can use promo code Todd to save 10% on your first purchase. Red, White, and Brand, here to put your logo on almost anything. redwhiteandbrand.com, promo code Todd. Quick timeout for me. Actually, I got a little bit of time here. Just a few seconds. Let me just set this up. I want to talk about, when we get back, the economic system that the Pilgrims were forced into. We're going to talk about what they learned from the first economic system they were forced into and what happened when Governor Bradford decided to flip that all on its head so that, well, in a way, I don't want to say desperation because they were still trusting in God, but out of desperation. So timeout is in order, my friends. We're going through the true story of Thanksgiving. See you on the other side of the break. Welcome back, my friends. I want to get to this. There's a lot of information to cover. Talking here about the true story of Thanksgiving. I love this. This is my favorite episode of the year. Friends, if you're dealing with discomfort or you're just tired of living off of prescriptions, managing side effects, you are not alone. A lot of folks are looking for something naturally that they can rely upon. That's why I think you should check out Christopher's Organic Botanicals. It's a family-run natural kratom company rooted in truth, transparency, and tradition. They partner directly with farmers in Indonesia. They lab test everything before it reaches your hands. There's no hype. There's no synthetics. No funny business. Just the real thing done right. So, I know you've heard horror stories if you've researched kratom. Those come from shady sellers. Those come from synthetic garbage that isn't even real kratom. But research it. Research it, understand it. And you can go to their website, Christopher'sOrganicBotanicals.com, but you can research on your own as well. But once you decide that this is something you feel comfortable with, if it's something that you think makes sense for what you're looking for, you can save 10% with coupon code Todd Huff at Christopher'sOrganicBotanicals.com. You can start with their kratom starter pack. Again, coupon code Todd Huff saves you 10%. Christopher'sOrganicBotanicals.com. That's Christopher'sOrganicBotanicals.com. Truth, tradition, transparency. All right, getting back to it here today, my friends. So before we left, I mentioned that we were going to talk about the economic system the Pilgrims were forced into. They had the Pilgrims had sponsors in London and in Holland. These were called merchant sponsors. These sponsors demanded that everything the Pilgrims had in their culture, in their society, in their community, everything that was produced would be put into a common store. And everyone had an equal share in that common store, in that bank. And they were going to distribute it equally. Now, it might not have ended up in there equally, but this, again, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, that was the direction this was leaning. So all the land, all the houses, everything belonged to everyone community in the community. The common store, it was a bank, a community, whatever you want to call it. No one owned anything. No one owned anything. It was a commune, and as Rush would say, this was a forerunner to the communes of the 1960s and the 1970s. And that's not literal, but there's certainly some commonalities. So Bradford realized this wasn't going to work. After getting through dealing with that first winter and realizing just as they were adjusting and figuring out life in the new world, he realized this wasn't going to work. So he decided to take bold action. He realized that socialism had failed them miserably, and what he decided to do was a bit novel at the time. He decided he was going to assign to each family its own plot of land within their commune, within their community. And then every family was given the ability to do with that land whatever they wanted. And what this did is this unleashed the powers of free market capitalism. See, Bradford had learned, as we all have learned, or we should have learned, that socialism kept people from working hard and being innovative. In fact, this is a line from his own journal. Again, this is a quote, so the English is going to be a little bit different than what we're used to today. But here's what it says. For this community, so far as it was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. For young men who were most able and fit for labor and service sat around and did nothing, should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without being paid for it. It was thought to be injustice. Why work for other people? In other words, they realized, hey, why am I getting up and busting my hump when all that I produce is going to be enjoyed by another person, another family, not my family, or a portion of it? I'm giving away more than I'm not getting proportionately what I'm producing. And so what's the incentive here? And this was a bad problem, especially in a place, in a new world where you had to be productive or you could literally die. It was necessary for there to be some form of incentive. The Pilgrims unharnessed the power of free enterprise, the principle of private property, by making these changes instituted by Governor Bradford. Bradford also wrote this after implementing these changes. He said, this had very good success, for it made, listen to this, all hands industrious, for as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. So suddenly he said, look, when people realized that they could reap the rewards of their labor, they produced more corn. In fact, he said it made people so industrious that there was so much more planted than would have been otherwise. So they could do what they wanted to do with the land, right? They could produce more corn, they could sell it, they could trade it, they could stock it up for themselves, whatever they had to do. No more of this shared commune crap where not many people worked very hard. They've done studies on this. I don't know if you've seen the studies where if there's a common field, people pick the crop before it is fully ripened. So you're getting less yield from a field because what happens is when you're going through that field and you realize this isn't mine, this is everybody else's, I'm going to pick something that isn't quite ready to be picked because someone else may pick it before I get my chance to get back in here. And then what am I going to have? They're worried that there's not enough because there isn't enough in socialism. This is the lesson. So, when profit was introduced, it grew like gangbusters. The Native Americans did not bring to the Pilgrims prosperity. They helped them, but this discovery, what we're talking about that Governor Bradford implemented, this is what ultimately worked. It was ultimately their own industriousness. It was ultimately their own hard work, their own incentive to be wiser, to make improvements. That is what ultimately made the change. Plus, these profits allowed them, remember those merchant, what were I'm drawing a blank here, the merchant sponsors, there we go. The merchant sponsors, remember those sponsors that paid for these trips in London and Holland? These folks, the profits were what they used to pay these debts off, to get that debt off of their shoulders. And not only that, the Great Puritan Migration resulted after this period of time, which, of course, there were other factors. I'm not here to say that it was just the prosperity of the Pilgrims, but it would be naive to say that this was not, the Great Puritan Migration was not at least fueled in part by the success of the Pilgrims. When they saw that this group of people went over there and succeeded, paid off their debtors, and had prosperity, this was an added incentive, I should say, for people to get to the New World. And as a result, the Great Puritan Migration took place. Prosperity became an added motivation for people that were already looking to flee. Remember, get that religious liberty, to get out of the persecuted world of Europe. That was enough to move them, but this, for some, helped to just give them a little bit more reason to get to the New World. It's that lesson, this lesson that William Bradford learned after giving people their own plots of land, letting them be prosperous, allowing them to be free, allowing them to work under the rules of free market capitalism. That is what William Bradford and the Pilgrims thanked God for during what we'll find out is the second Thanksgiving. They thanked God for their prosperity. The Native Americans certainly saved in that first winter, or after that first winter, and helped the Pilgrims, no doubt about it, but they did not make them prosperous. This change is what made them prosperous. So they had a second Thanksgiving in 1623. You'll realize there wasn't a second Thanksgiving in 1622, but there is one in 1623. That was the second Thanksgiving. So 1621 was number one, 1623 was the second one. So 1623, they had been living under free market capitalism now for 2 years. So they had been surviving in the early times, but now they were prospering. They stopped, they overturned, they flipped that investors' rule that said everyone had to have an equal share. They established private property rights. They established a capitalistic system. Great provisions were the result. And then not only that, but once you have enough provision to where people can specialize, right? I built an economy to where this guy's good at building houses, this guy's good at raising livestock. We all can become specialists. That leads to even more prosperity, which of course is further down the road from where the Pilgrims were, but that's the direction. They were laying the foundation for those things to happen. The real story, my friends, of Thanksgiving is not complete until you understand that second Thanksgiving, which I'm going to talk about in our last segment, which I'm out of time for here now. Got to take a quick time out, my friends. You're listening here to Conservative Not Bitter Talk. I'm your host, Todd Huff. Back in just a minute. Welcome back, my friends. This is my favorite episode of the year. I hope you enjoy it as well. I love talking about this for lots of reasons. I outlined those off the top of the program. And I'm going to wrap it up here in our final segment of this particular program. But friends, before I do that, let's talk about something that's important. Your money. Your money today. We've been talking about the Pilgrims' prosperity, their money. Let's talk about your money today. You've worked hard for it, but is it working hard for what you believe in? The Pilgrims left everything, my friends, to come live in a land of religious liberty, to flee religious persecution. They put their money where their mouth was, And it's time that we take this seriously as well. At 48 Financial, they specialize in biblically responsible investing. That means they screen out companies that do not align with your faith, your values, and they'll help create a plan that fits your goals and your purpose. The best part is that they'll show you how your current investments, what you currently have your money invested in, they'll do an analysis on this. It's easy for them to do. You just have to answer a few questions, quick and painless on your side. And then they'll tell you to what degree your current investments are aligned with or stacked up against your values. All you have to do is go to 48financial.com/Todd to take the assessment. That's 48financial.com/Todd. Complete that assessment. It's quick and easy. I've done it. You can do it too. 48 Financial, helping you align your money with your mission. All right, friends. So before the break, we introduced the second Thanksgiving. This wasn't called at the time the second Thanksgiving, but Governor Bradford, if you read in his journals, you'll hear him talking about a day of humiliation and prayer. There was a drought that summer in 1623, and they had a day of humiliation and prayer, pleading with God to end the drought. And later on, they had a day of thanksgiving after the rains came. So the Pilgrims were devout. They sought God. I mean, God, listen, you don't know what God can do until God is all you have. And God was all the Pilgrims had. They certainly had help from the Native Americans, and I don't want that part to get lost because that is important. But what is dramatically more important is the provision provided by God and the lessons that they learned through their difficulties. Friends, we lose, a lot of us just want pain and difficulty to stop. I can attest to this personally. But pain is, as C.S. Lewis said, pain is God's megaphone. It's an opportunity for us to learn. It's an opportunity for him to speak truth into our lives, and that's what happened here. That's what happened here. The first Thanksgiving was about simple survival. They were grateful that they made it through. Half of them died, remember, that first winter. The second Thanksgiving, 2 years later, my friends, wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about prosperity. They had learned a lesson that would change the trajectory of life on this planet as we know it, life in this country as we know it. And it radically transformed the living conditions, the life expectancy, all these things can be traced back. Many things can be traced back to the lessons that were learned by the Pilgrims, by others as well. But this is a wonderful story that goes perfectly hand in hand with this Thanksgiving season. And they thanked God. They thanked God, understanding that these things all come from their Creator. The prophets allowed them to pay off their debts. It encouraged others to come to the New World. It marked the beginning of the Great Puritan Migration of the 1600s, my friends. It's a wonderful story. The story of Thanksgiving is not complete if we stop after the first Thanksgiving. We must understand what happened from that first winter through the summer and early fall of 1623 to get the full picture. So I hope that this has helped to put that into perspective or to remind you, my friends, of what had to happen for us to have what we have today. Remarkable sacrifice by the Pilgrims. Friends, let me take a moment here in the final minute or so that I have here on this program. We'll be out tomorrow and Friday. I did produce a new Todd Talk, so you'll hear, if you want to hear the Todd Talk, there's one of those on Friday. But we'll be out tomorrow, Thanksgiving Day and Friday. Let me say to you my personal gratitude. And this is, I got to tell you, this is hard for me. Not hard for me to say it, but it gets me every stinking time, every year. I am thankful, my friends. I am thankful for you, the listener of this program. You mean the world to me when I hear from you, when you send in emails, whatever. I am grateful for you. This would be 100% impossible without you. I am grateful for those who advertise on this program. Friends, if you're an advertiser on this program, try to find a way to support those folks as well. Listen, I'm not asking you to do charity, but if you use the products that they sell and provide, try to find a way to do business with them. The stations that allow us to be on here, friends, I'm grateful. Grateful for the stations, grateful for the team here at the Todd Huff Show, grateful for my wife, who does more than any of you may fully recognize than I recognize. She's, of course, Oz here in the studio. But most importantly, I'm thankful to God, my Creator, my Savior. He's the one, my friends, that we should all ultimately be thankful to, as the Pilgrims were all those many years ago. So, friends, have a happy Thanksgiving. I will see you on Monday. SDG.